All right, everyone, we're at the top of the hour. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so let's get this started. So first, welcome to our first, I'm going to do it, our first journal club of the decade. So very, very excited to welcome some fabulous colleagues to discuss, I think, an interesting and important topic with us this afternoon. Ariel and Will, I will let you guys introduce yourself to our colleagues on the line once we get started. Just to orient folks who may not have attended one of our journal clubs before, this is one of the most informal sort of approaches we take of all of our educational offerings. And I'm actually going to, I'm going to go a bit nuts today. I'm going to unmute all of our attendees. So folks, if you're joining as a discussant, I'm thrilled you're here. What I am going to ask is that at least I'm going to try to in a second, that if you can mute on your end, and then in terms of asking questions, there's a couple of options. If you're somewhere that's a little bit loud, please feel free to type your questions into the chat. Ariel and will give a brief overview on their manuscript from their side, and then we'll throw it open to questions. So they will be reviewing the Q&A box. Also, please feel free to raise your hand, and then you are very welcome as well to give voice to your question. And obviously we welcome follow-up and good discussion. So very informal, look forward to a great conversation. I'm going to go ahead and unmute our attendees. Ariel and Will, thank you for joining us. It's a terrific paper. Tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Jen, and thank you everyone who's joining the conversation. I mean, I guess, should we introduce ourselves quickly, or is that?
Please, yep.
Yeah, so in brief, I'm an associate professor at Harvard Business School. My background is in healthcare economics, but very broadly, I study the economics and management of new technologies in the healthcare space. So that, includes things, that we're not talking about today, like precision medicines, but also technologies that we will be talking about today, things like healthcare IT, digital medicine, and then as a subset thereof, the applications of AI to healthcare delivery. So that's a bit about, but I'm the sort of resident economist business school professor. And I'll let my long time and many time collaborator Will tell you about himself.
Great, thanks, Ariel. So I am Will Gordon. I am a physician here at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Hospital medicine is my specialty. Background as a computer software engineer many years ago. Very interested in digital health. Have spent some time in industry, and really split my time between research. So research, clinical informatics, trying to understand how what we do on the digital side is making things better, or in some cases not making things better. And also spent a lot of time actually building software and work at Partners Healthcare in Boston and lead a clinical product development group. So really excited to talk about this. I think this is so top of mind. I mean, even I was telling Ariel a little bit earlier that even yesterday I was on a phone call with folks here trying to figure out how to implement certain machine learning models into our EHR system. So it's very, very relevant, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Great. So Jen, I think you're going to help us out with the slides. We have, I think, just 4 brief introductory slides, so please bear with us, and then we can hopefully open up the conversation.
Perfect. So in this paper, we start with, like every machine learning paper or AI paper these days, we start with definitions. I think at some point AI papers will no longer need to define AI. I'm not sure when that will happen, but it's still in the stage where we're defining it. And so we define it as the development of intelligent machines that perform really human intelligence-like functioning. So thinking, problem solving, those types of actions. And I think broadly we group it into these 3 categories, and these are not mutually exclusive. There is overlap. But if you think about natural language processing as a first category, this is interpreting human expression or human language. That's definitely a big part of what AI is used for, has potential for. Machine processing, where you just have huge amounts of data and inputs coming through that need some ability to process and interpret. Self-driving cars are a big example in this bucket. And finally, machine learning, which is a system that actually learns from itself, or from the experience of it actually functioning. So it has a way of performing, and it's a model, but the model actually is able to look at the output, look at the implications of the outputs that it's making, and then reevaluate itself and learn from those experiences. And that's like chess. I think the online chess that is a good example of that. And Jen, can you go to the next slide? So in this paper, in this article, we really try to answer the question, how can AI be used to improve healthcare delivery? So clearly AI holds promise for almost every industry. I would actually even say it goes beyond promise at this point. It's being used in many industries with real results. But we tried to really focus on healthcare delivery as a specific example. And by this, we meant for clinicians and provider organizations specifically. And so we did this through 3 buckets. We go into a lot of detail in these 3 buckets in the paper. The first is administrative work. And these are things like provider documentation, online scheduling or scheduling optimization, provider order entry. Are there other ways to automate that or think about intelligence there? These are sometimes more back-end like functioning, but really important for healthcare delivery. Number 2, and apologize for all the ones there. Number 2 is diagnosis. So how can AI be used for improving our ability to diagnose disease and diagnose the patients that we take care of? There are tons of examples here. Actually, this is probably one of the most ripe places for this right now, and a lot of work in various imaging modalities. It includes radiology, but it also includes visual fields like pathology, ophthalmology, and dermatology. And there's been a lot of work that's been done in those spaces. Phenotyping is another example where AI is used to actually think about new clinical entities, new ways of grouping patients into different disease states. Symptom analysis is another example there. And then finally, the third bucket that we talk about is treatment. So how can AI be used helping surgeons operate, or helping gastroenterologists better find polyps, for example, during colonoscopies, health coaching, treatment advice, etc. So treatment is a really important category for where AI holds potential here. And Jen, go over to the next slide. I'm actually going to hand it over to Ariel for this one.
Great. Yeah, and this is, I think, just get your questions ready. I'll just preface this by saying I think this is the last introductory slide that Will and I wanted to walk folks through before we open up the conversation. In addition to really articulating what are the 3 broad categories where AI can be applied in the healthcare delivery setting, the other thing that we do in this piece is present a framework for the actual stages of technology development and diffusion. This is based on an old MIT Tech Review framework around the stages of technology development. What we did for this piece is modify that for the healthcare delivery AI setting. And Will mentioned just a few moments ago just how the extent to which AI and other technologies have proliferated in other industries. I think the thing that I feel compelled to just remind everyone of in healthcare, I think, and Will and I were also just talking about earlier today, is that a lot of these examples are really to the left of this diagram. I think some of the most promising and exciting examples from our paper are really in the stage 2 and stage 3 phase. So, well beyond, in many cases, idea generation, things that are academic research that show proof of concept, perhaps even a prototype is available, or somewhere between stage 3 and stage 4, where there's a working prototype, there's a Nature article, there is one hospital that's successfully using a technology or one hospital system, but companies are still working towards commercialization, and then very broad scale diffusion and implementation. I think that is both the challenge and the opportunity here. And I think something that we're happy to take questions on and discuss more are both the clinical and managerial next steps and the challenges and opportunities of actually moving towards commercialization, as well as diffusion and broad implementation. Will and I were having a bit of a philosophical conversation earlier about, like, what does diffusion mean? You know, in other healthcare contexts, diffusion of, for example, a pharmaceutical product would mean, you know, widespread use for the majority of eligible patients. I think it's very difficult to come up with an example of an AI technology in healthcare that has that sort of broad diffusion. However, there are some great examples where you do see not only the implementation, but the diffusion of certain technologies throughout an entire hospital or throughout an entire hospital system. But I think we're still working on the very large scale stuff. So with that, I think there's just a closer slide after this, Jen. So we're happy to open it up, entertain any questions, comments, criticisms, etc. And I have the chat window open as well. So.
Hello, hi. My name's PIP Griffith. I'm a psychometrician. Actually, I work mainly in clinical trials, but I think as we go closer to this sort of machine learning and artificial intelligence, I think the boundaries between things like delivery and development start to merge as well. So anyway, I'd like to thank you for the great paper. It was really an eye-opening read, and all the examples were really interesting. I've got lots of questions, but I'm focus on one, let other people speak, and then maybe I'll come back to some others after. So Elon Musk has recently dropped all patents on his cars to make sure that the world can develop this technology quicker. Now, this is a bit of a two-part question. So to what extent do you think there's an ethical responsibility to A, share data for AI development, things like anything from things Google collects to maybe even NHS sensitive data, and then B, open up proprietary black boxes of commercial AI algorithms for future development, to have a sort of platform to build up on?
Yeah. I should have mentioned early on that we were going to take no Elon Musk questions. Maybe I can start on. I think on the ethical data one, and maybe I'll leave the proprietary black box one to you. On the ethical data question, I think is one of the most important questions we can ask. Now, I kind of want to think about it in terms of reproducibility. So, and that has to be balanced against privacy. So I don't think there's an expectation that if I develop a machine learning algorithm that uses data from my hospital, that I'm going to publicly post the patient data that went into the algorithm development, right? So there obviously privacy is a really important part of that. But I also don't think that people are going to trust models that are not reproduced or not reproducible. And so I think it'll be really important to find the balance of how we can let these models be reproducible without disclosing private information about patients in the process of doing that. And I don't have a great answer for that right now, but I do think that is something that it's going to be critical, because no one's going to trust them if we can't validate them, if they're not reproducible by other groups.
Yeah. So second all of that. I'm gonna share a link in the chat window. I had not planned to use this call as a plug for my other research, but here we are. This is what I'm sharing with everyone is just a link to an article that came out just a couple months ago that I wrote with one of my health law friends, Nichols and Price, who's at the University of Michigan. And it's, Pip, it's related to your question. It's about what the potential role for regulatory bodies might be in safe and effective healthcare machine learning. So, I think to the extent that a lot of, not all certainly, but a lot of these technologies are going to start to look like regulated medical technologies. I think in particular, circling back to our article in the diagnostic category, you know, a lot of what we're seeing stateside in terms of what the FDA is looking at in terms of regulated medical devices are diagnostic algorithms, and there's some really exciting things afoot. The FDA has been incredibly sort of thoughtful and proactive about thinking about how to regulate these technologies, and what we argue is, you know, to the extent that so what I would say is, you know, to the extent that these are regulated technologies, I think there's an incredibly important role for regulators in ensuring some of those things Will was talking about in terms of reproducibility, and to some extent transparency of algorithms. You know, I think I'm dialing in from Germany so I'm actually on the other side of the Atlantic right now, where there has been some really exciting, I don't know if we have any other local Germans on the line, but there have been some very exciting developments recently, where the federal government actually just passed a new German Digital Healthcare Act, but they're struggling on the policy side with precisely some of the issues, which is sort of how does data sharing work? How does that fit under the new, you know, GDPR, which affects all European citizens and institutions, and how do we think about striking the right balance between reproducibility and patient privacy, which I think is you know, one that we just need to keep talking about.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a very big, very big couple of questions there. I think you handled them well, so thanks for that.
Yeah, it's as one of my colleagues likes to say, the current state of healthcare policy is a full employment program for individuals willing to understand its nuances. So.
Fantastic. I'm going to jump in, Pip. That was a great question. I'm going to dive in. I came with a laundry list of my own, so while folks warm up to questions, let me throw one in, guys. Taking a bit of a 180 from that last question, the piece that really sort of stood out to me, you described, you know, frankly, the bloat of administrative work in our sort of healthcare system. And when we couple that with what we know is a huge sort of clinical burden around administration and documentation, I guess I'm curious to get your thoughts. In your remarks opening, Ariel, you said, you know, a lot of this, the development of these AI offerings are still quite early stage, but if we think about particularly some of the administrative work, do we actually envisage a healthcare system where we can trim some of that fat? Do we actually think we're going to be rewarded with, you know, practicing clinicians reporting less stress due to documentation and that crazy, I think, 2.5 to 1 ratio of administrators to providers? Do we see that changing? Or is this going to be a yes and?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I'll let Will jump in a minute, but this is actually for a different project that Will and I are actually working on, thinking about electronic health records. I mean, I think this is, you know, something that bears, you know, just underscoring, which is the extent to which a lot of clinicians feel really overburdened by the paperwork of medicine, which is, you know, an add-on to the healthcare delivery side. I mean, I think that's the real promise, Jen. And I would just, before I hand over to Will, just add one thought, which is, in many respects, the administrative applications are really, really sort of closer to our reach in terms of implementation than things like diagnosis and treatment. And the reason is because, you know, beyond, of course, the very important privacy requirements, there aren't going to be regulatory requirements. So unlike something that would have all of the trappings of a diagnostic device and therefore require, at a minimum, an expedited period of regulatory review, something that a tool that's HIPAA compliant that can easily integrate with existing electronic record systems and electronic scheduling systems, and of course that's a big if, is something that can be deployed rather quickly because it above and beyond HIPAA compliance wouldn't necessitate something like regulatory review. And so I think that a lot of this remains to be seen. And Jen, to your point, I think so many of these tools are so nascent that we should reconvene the group in 5 years and see what we've learned. But I think, when I talk about this, I often say that that the administrative applications are some of those that are closest at hand, because they have the potential to be deployed rather quickly in a way that diagnosis and treatment will simply take longer. And again, unlike treatment, don't have to worry about things like legal liability. There was a terrific article that came out in JAMA a month or two ago, which I can try to dig up a link to as well, about clinician liability for AI and algorithms in the healthcare delivery setting. You don't really have to worry about that with scheduling issues in the way that you do when you have an AI tool that's making treatment recommendations. So that's what I'll say. Will, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think that's all. It's spot on. I can give an example of the so revenue cycle. I'm sure folks are familiar with that. If not, it's the process of capturing charge money value from clinical encounters, and it's really a critical part of hospital operations and extremely highly staffed. So many institutions, for every 3 or 4 full-time doctors, there's a full-time medical coder, which is kind of a crazy ratio when you think about it. And I think that is an example where AI could absolutely do charge capture. There are companies that are doing this, could reduce the administrative overhead of what is unfortunately a necessary part of care delivery, and could really decrease the overall administrative costs of a hospital system, and without having to go through an IRB or the FDA or really anything, because it's back end, it's billing, it's not delivering care, it's just making the delivery of care leaner. So I think there's real potential, and I do think that's going to be some of the first places where we have already seen value and will continue to see value while we try to sort out the more complicated clinical treatment stuff.
Fantastic. That was very helpful. Thank you. And I've seen we've had some questions pouring into the chat box. Colleen, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question to Ariel and Will?
Sure, Jen, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you. This question does get down into the weeds a little bit. I'm wondering, how does the AI system measure its own effectiveness? And specifically, I'm thinking of the example from the slide where you mentioned treatment as one of the third applications, and an example you gave was with health coaching. My question is, how does the system know it's making a difference in the context of an example like treatment with health coaching?
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I mean, I think, and I'll sort of jump in here as the person who does healthcare economics and some of the analytics around that, but Will, please follow. So I think, I think, I'll just mention, I mentioned before that I'm calling in from Germany, where there was recently this new German Digital Health Act passed that actually provided a bunch of, and this is key, provided for reimbursement for digital health solutions when there is an evidence base for their effectiveness. So it's related to your question, Colleen, which is Germany is about to basically open up its markets for reimbursing digital tools in a way that's pretty unprecedented by a major economy, but it's going to demand of these companies that AI companies and other digital health companies measure their own effectiveness, which is exactly what your question was. And so it requires us to be really thoughtful about data before and after. I'll give you one example, which is a company that we mention only very briefly in the piece, but one that I actually published a business case about a couple of years ago, which is a company called Twine Health that folks might have heard of. When they were, so it's a chronic disease management app, and when they were trying to design their first trials, they had to be really thoughtful about what do the different treatment arms look like. And so their first trials were in hypertension patients. I guess the good news is that with hypertension, we have quite a bit of historical data about what the standard of care for hypertension looks like. And so the question is, how do you compare different types of interventions? So one intervention arm you could think of as the actual standard of care, which is, go to your primary care physician, they tell you your blood pressure is too high, prescribe you some medicines and say, come back in 90 days. Another comparison arm of a trial then involved actually just assigning patients to health coaches without the addition of this algorithm-driven app that actually helped with management. So in that case, what you can do is say, okay, well, what's the difference between just the standard of care or the standard of care plus a health coach? And then the third arm of the trial then asks, what about a health coach, but moderated by an algorithm-driven app that actually adjusts to patient-specific needs and progression? And so what you're doing in that case is you're actually comparing the patients who were assigned to the full treatment arm of the trial to partial treatment versus just the standard of care. And so what the Twine folks were able to do in one of their early studies is show that patients who were using the app with a health coach were getting better outcomes, both than just the standard of care, but also having a health coach alone. And so that gives you, the difference basically in treatment effects between those groups gives you some measure of what is the additional added value of the app above and beyond that. But I think, I hope that's a helpful example. More broadly, I think your question is really prescient because it's just we are now entering into a world where folks want to see reimbursement, or want to see evidence before they agree to reimbursement. And so I think we're going to have to be very thoughtful about study design, and not just say, oh, this is a great app because patients like it, but actually measuring meaningful health outcomes. I'll stop there.
That's great, Ariel. Thank you so much. That answers my question. I'm wondering then, with kind of a segue into which measurement tools then do you use? And it sounds like, that's a whole nother level of having to create and validate potentially tools that will enable you to measure that change. So I'll just stop there, but thank you so much.
Colleen, thank you so much. I'm keeping tabs on questions coming in. So we'll go to Isaac, then Casey, then Pip. Isaac, do you want to go off mute and share your question with us?
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. One of the things that is keeping me awake during the night time is how do we go about potential validation of artificial intelligence that is utilizing adaptive software, continuously learning software, which will be used in healthcare? Do you have any thoughts about this? And you may not have a final answer to it, but I just wanted to pick on your brilliant minds and see what aspects should be considered to validate this kind of adaptive software.
Maybe, Isaac, maybe you could give an example of what you mean by adaptive software, just so that we're all talking, referring to the same thing.
So adaptive software, as I understand it, is the one that can incorporate different algorithms and can make adjustments. For example, when you are doing diagnostics, the artificial intelligence with adaptive software is able to distinguish, say, in cancer, different sizes of a tumor and indicate if it's early, mid-level, or late stage. And so it's constantly learning, it's constantly adjusting parameters to identify the specific type of cancer and make the specific type of diagnosis. This is different compared to having what is called a locked software, which has just one algorithm that is not changing and is not continuously learning to make a diagnosis, as an example of the diagnosis. Did I explain that?
Yes, yeah. And the word adaptive is used a lot, and people talk about adaptive trial designs. So I wanted to make sure that we were, that I understood what you were referring to. So that is a fantastic question. And I think it's something that is very, it's probably a little bit more on the frontier of AI research in healthcare. And so that the question is really, part of the value proposition of machine learning and artificial intelligence is that the model or the decision-making engine is able to iteratively make itself better as it performs, whether it's within software or some other environment, right? And so that's what you want. You want it to adapt. It should be continuously understanding the outcomes and changing.
That is correct.
Yeah.
It is how do we validate that specific AI so that it can be implemented.
Right. And the challenge is that in most software development life cycles or any clinical validated clinical pathway, there's a lot of work spent in validating it, and then once it's validated, it's considered done and implemented and used. And there are a few examples of retrospectively going back and looking at outcomes. I think phase 4 trials are an example of that. But in AI, where potentially the models are changing every minute, or potentially with new data, this becomes a major problem. The data itself can also change. There's this notion of data drift, which is your underlying source data can change what it means, or can change significance over time. And so even if your model doesn't change, but your data does change, your model is effectively changing because it's no longer validated against the data that it was used to be trained. So I don't have a great answer, and I'm definitely curious Ariel's thoughts on this. I think one of the things that we do here, we spend a lot of time on continuous integration, continuous deployment, and continuous QA. And the notion is that you build a process for validation that can be run every minute, every day, every hour, so that when things change around you, the validation processes can also change and revalidate something that's changing. That's relatively straightforward to do for fixed software. It's much more complicated to do for something like an AI implementation, where validation can require tens of thousands of patients. So it's hard, I think, is basically my answer. And I think what needs to be considered is the data. Is the data changing? Is data drift around? And the overall processes for deploying the artificial intelligence need to be continuously updated and monitored in a very flexible, real-time way. So I think that's how I would approach it, but I don't have a definitive answer. I don't know that anyone's really figured this out for healthcare yet. I don't know if that helps, if that answers your question.
Okay, so I didn't know that you were going back to me. I thought that you were talking to Ariel. So, well, I don't have a final answer either. That's why this interaction and my question, to see what you guys were thinking about this. I am personally thinking of, for example, when we think of validation of these AIs, we are thinking about levels of abstraction and ranges, in addition to the continuous quality systems that we put in place. And so I was thinking about a range, essentially, because there are limits, lower and higher limits of how things can be detected, or how, a range of 0 to X about treatment, or the same goes for the administration, if we think about the 3 buckets that you mentioned. So I'm thinking about ranges in addition to the items that you mentioned. And I don't know if I am thinking in the right way or not. I don't have a final answer either. That's why I brought this up.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a topic that I think needs more discovery. Another example of something that we think a lot about is versioning algorithms. So if a model changes, let's say once a day, you need to know which version of the model was used to make a clinical decision, so that you can understand why a decision was made. This is maybe for a treatment example. That same bar is probably not there for something administrative, but you still need to be aware that the underlying decision-making apparatus is changing, potentially day by day, hour by hour. That's very, very different than how we traditionally deliver care. So
Mentioning of the AI will be part of the quality system, the continuous quality system that is implemented, and I agree with you on that. Another aspects that can come to mind would be, as I am thinking of this, is are we still using the AI for the same specific purpose or intention? Are we changing the parameters? Are we increasing or not risk to the patient or the participant? And are we adding elements that are completely new, that are changing the software completely, that will require may trigger a new set of validation studies?
Yep. Yeah, and there's a regulatory aspect to this as well. If
I'm thinking about, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yep. If you get approved, if you go through the effort of studying, doing an actual randomized control trial for an AI algorithm or some sort of AI implementation, you show that it's valuable, show that it improves outcomes, you get it approved. That model is going to change by definition of it being machine learning or AI. So what is the role for regulatory bodies in the space? It's a great question, and yeah, I think we should all continue to think about it.
Two things for that specific regulatory aspect. One is we look at, I am at the FDA, so we look at the safety of any patient or participant, and evidently data quality and data integrity, and how the artificial intelligence software that you are using would impact interactive parameters. And I will stop right there. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you.
Isaac, terrific questions. Thank you so much. I'd like to call on Casey. You have the next question. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I am. And
terrific.
I mean, I'm glad that Isaac and Will, and I think Ariel brought up regulatory issues, because I'm going to do what I do is I'm going to ask a question from the ground. Because I'm among other things, patient community leader, there are conversations going on all the time about privacy concerns as AI becomes more of an emerging thing in healthcare delivery, both here in the US and around the world. And I'm looking for some guidance on how we, patient community leaders, can better present the pros and cons of AI in healthcare to the communities that look to us for information, guidance, etc. And this is particularly in light of the recent headlines, screaming headlines about the Project Nightingale thing, the agreement between Ascension and Google to basically do AI at scale on a whole bunch of records from the Ascension system. And I will also observe that I'm paywalled in trying to actually read the journal article under discussion. So, but what do you guys have for me in the way of some ideas on communicating the pros and cons of AI in healthcare delivery so that people, the ones called patients, can more meaningfully participate in this public discussion and also in the technology modalities, et cetera, being introduced?
Casey, can I actually ask you a question? I know you asked us a question, but I might turn around for a second just for more context. Have you, being on the ground, what have you heard? Obviously the extension thing made a lot of news, but I'm just curious what concerns you've heard from folks and how you
most of the concerns echo the same ones that have been coming out of the patient community for a while. And when I say a while, I mean, some number of years, but that got particularly loud in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica mess, and the Facebook vuln, etc. But people are either just resigned to the idea that our robot overlords are basically going to run over us, or they're joining the tinfoil hat crowd and saying, I'm not going to do anything that, no consent. And I'm like, good luck with that, because if you want to get seen by a doctor, you're going to have to sign a HIPAA agreement thing. And even if you cross stuff out, they're going to ignore it. So the conversations are probably even more ferocious in my part of the forest than they are in the professional side. But I'm trying to figure out how to help drive this forward while continuing to actually respect, as opposed to give lip service, to respect for the idea of privacy, that's a larger tech industry problem. Forget just healthcare. But the fact that the tech, that the tech platforms, the tech infrastructure that we have now, essentially has become a giant ad platform, and everybody else is just kind of thumbing a ride.
Yeah. So another great question. I'll just make one comment, and I think that one approach here. There's a lot of this is a very challenging question. I think one approach would be to highlight a lot of the positive research and work so far. Recognize the privacy challenges, because they're definitely there, but highlight some of the research that's been done that really is exciting, whether it's melanoma diagnosis or—
Is any of it open access?
The actual publications, you mean?
Yep.
I'll have to check. Some of it definitely is, because I've reviewed for open access journals on this. I'm happy to send you some of them.
And I will take them, sir. Thank you.
Yep.
And I'm talking to myself on mute. Let's plan before we post these slides. Well, if you send them to me, let's update the deck with these resources. And then, Casey, they'll be available both to you and anyone else who's crawling around on our website. They can access those pieces, because I think it's a critically important question. And, access and sharing across the whole paradigm, right, from the original data all the way through to the findings at the end, is really important. So,
and I cannot overstate enough the idea that public involvement, and not by everyone in the public, but for those of us who are sort of, bringing the public information about this and attempting to communicate the pros and cons, if we can have access to the actual evidence, it's a hell of a lot helpful,
Critical. So, Casey, thank you. And this is something we should think about more at DiMe as well.
Casey, can I interject 1 second, Jen?
Please, Isaac, please.
So a few things to give you for consideration. As Will was saying, there are obvious positive aspects in the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare, in the healthcare system, in clinical research. Some of those are well articulated that has been discussed today, but the advantages can be even larger than that. From the negative standpoint, or the limitations or challenges, if you will, think about from the end user perspective, and you can create in that capacity from the administrative, from the legal, from the operational, from the logistical, from the regulatory standpoint. And that will be, those items or buckets will be guiding principles as well to elaborate on each of these buckets as to where the limitations are, because it really comes to the end user and how that artificial intelligence will be used. That's my suggestion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Isaac, thank you so much, and really appreciate you joining us and providing that perspective this afternoon. Casey, big question, lots more food for thought. And then I'm going to suggest we round out with some delicious symmetry in our session. Pip, you posed the first question. Let me invite you to ask the last one of Will and Ariel for this lunchtime.
Thanks for letting me ask another. So thinking about it, I think this links like a thread for the last one, is the last question as well to some extent. Is it, you know, that AI is likely to emerge in high resource centers. So this is kind of, you know, it could lead to some amount of bias in the people who have access to the AI. People maybe have access to understanding the AI, but potentially also the data that the AI is based on. So if AI is likely to emerge and be trained on and maybe even built for these high resource centers, to what extent do you think this will, two-part question, A, hinder progress of AI, and B, introduce risk into the system and the algorithmic decisions?
So I know Ariel's having some technical difficulties.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me okay? I apologize.
I can, yes.
And I actually,
Did you hear that question? Okay.
I heard that question loud and clear. I was having, I apologize. I turned my video off, so hopefully that'll help. No, I mean, I think this is you know, a really important question. What legal scholars call this problem is contextual bias, which is that we train algorithmic tools in one context, and then when we apply them to others, they don't work. I think you know, of course, a quite prominent example that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with is this article that came out in Science late last year that showed that algorithms that were, or just algorithms based on biased patient data. So, you know, risk algorithms for that are used by hospitals. This was an algorithm used by United Healthcare because African-American patients utilize the healthcare system less. They were actually getting less recommended health care, even for folks who are equally sick. So, you know, there's, I think there are multiple concerns one might have. One might be that, you know, and it's sort of a garbage in, garbage out question. If you're using data from an unequal healthcare system to inform how you're going to train algorithms about how to treat patients, then you're going to get an algorithm that makes recommendations that are not necessarily in the best interest of patients who are already disadvantaged by the system. I think the other concern is that, I think this is what you were getting at, sort of the best practices for a large academic medical center might not be the same as those that would be appropriate for a small community hospital in a rural setting. And just trying to wholesale apply a machine learning algorithm from one context to another could lead to a bunch of troubles. I think the good news is that this is at least on the radar now in a way that wasn't meaningfully the case a year or two ago. But this is absolutely as we get into the you know, diffusion and implementation stages of things, something that healthcare leaders are going to need to be vigilant about. You know, I think this is actually, I'll just say one more thing. Can everyone hear me okay still?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. I'll just say one more thing, and it's just slightly related to Casey's last comment, which is that one of my colleagues at Harvard and I are actually trying to write a piece, an article right now that would start to address some of these questions. Basically, you know, the subtitle of the article is, you know, so you're a hospital leader or a hospital manager who's thinking of applying an AI tool in your hospital. What do you need to think about? And, you know, I think, Casey, there's a patient analog there, which is sort of what are the questions that one might ask about a tool like this in terms of, you know, privacy, safety, transparency, replicability is a topic that already came up. You know, I think these are questions that patients and clinicians are going to have. I think, you know, the other thing that there's, you know, I hang out with a lot of very technically savvy doctors like Will, but actually the vast majority of clinicians, you know, did their medical training before there was, you know, broadband was widely available, and simply didn't grow up in the digital era. And so I think having something is, doctors love checklists. Having a checklist for how to apply AI tools in the clinical setting and what questions to ask, both from the clinician side and the patient side, I think will be valuable as we start to get at questions about safety and replicability and transferability of algorithms.
Fantastic. Ariel, Will, this was absolutely tremendous. I took a lot of notes, I learned a lot, and excuse me, everyone, and really enjoyed the questions from the group. I think that these sort of small discussions among our members are some of the most sort of thoughtful and valuable work we do. So appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. I'm going to skip forward and just quickly highlight a few upcoming events before we break. Before I do that, folks, Casey just posted a terrific link to an organization called the Light Collective. If you're not familiar with them, definitely take a look. And then I'll work with Ariel and Will before we post our slides to include some of the resources that we discussed today. So Will, Ariel, thank you. And folks on the line, if you care to join us for our first lightning speed crowdsourcing event. This is where some of our members have questions about their companies and their products, and they're seeking to mine the wisdom of the crowd and our experts and community here at DiMe. It's a half-hour quick chat. So if you have time on the 28th, please join us. And next month, our journal club is with Ewan Clay, now at Evidation Health. And he will be talking about his manuscript that I believe he shared to the Slack, continuous monitoring of walking speed in frail elderly patients. So another terrific conversation. Will and Ariel, you've set the bar very high for this new decade. This is a pleasure, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Great. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.